Kellynch, Dragon Persuasion. Book 6 of Jane Austen's Dragons. By Maria Grace. Narrated by Benjamin Fife. Chapter 1. Early June, 1814. Anne glanced right and left down the long hallway tiled in black and white marble squares, the portraits of long-forgotten ancestors staring down, disapproving, for they disapproved of everything, upon her. Yes, no sign of father or Elizabeth, only Mrs. Trent, the sturdy, grizzled housekeeper, trundling the recently delivered post toward the parlour. Anne hurried to intercept, glancing first at the letters in Mrs. Trent's hands, then cocking her head. Best not make a sound, lest she be discovered. Father and Elizabeth were always the most demanding when she had other plans. Mrs. Trent nodded and handed her several thick missives from the bottom of the stack. Excellent. One sealed with blue wax, and it was the one she was waiting for. She clasped the letters to her chest and hurried outside in the opposite direction of the parlour. Though Father and Elizabeth rarely cared for any news that might come by way of Anne, still it would be better to read her mail alone, especially when the thickest message bore the Blue Order's seal. The pale green muslin skirts of her day dress swished against her ankles as she darted out of the kitchen door. Yes, it was a bad habit using the staff's doorways, and it left her smelling like the kitchen. But was it really so bad to smell a bit like baking bread while obtaining her freedom? Cook did not even raise an eyebrow at her comings and goings any more. Light, bright, and sunny, everything a summer's day should be. A soft, warm breeze kissed her face with the fragrance of peonies and roses. So thick and lovely she could almost taste them weaving together in the sunshine. Her favourite bench in the garden called her, the filigreed iron one, painted white and placed in the middle of the flower beds, so that Mamma could comfortably watch the antics of the local fairy dragon harem. The tiny dragons frequented the lavishly blooming flower beds, especially on days like this, when the sun was warm and brilliant, and the wind was calm, allowing the garden air to fill with sweet perfume. Mother had liked this place for excellent reasons. Anne sat down and set aside the first letter. Given the handwriting on the direction, it was no doubt a demand for payment by the wine merchant. That should have gone to Elizabeth or Father, since Anne had no authorization to make such payments. Perhaps Mrs. Trent thought Anne might actually manage to see a remittance was made. She was, after all, quite the optimist. Good thing she bore disappointment graciously. Anne cracked the flour and water seal on her other letter, lest she forget about it, in the almost certain flurry the Blue Order's news would bring.
What are you doing?
A bright pink fairy dragon, Peony, circled, her wings buzzing low over Anne's head. I am reading my letters. She shaded her eyes and peered into the sky. Where are your friends today? You are not usually alone.
The others are mad at me. Wrencatcher caught me in a mating flight yesterday.
Peony, the lead female of the harem, warbled a self-satisfied little sound. Anne blushed. Dragons lacked discretion, but it was their way, at least according to Lady Russell, and they ought not be rebuked for it. Peony landed on the back of the bench and peered at the letters. Her head cocked so far, it nearly turned upside down. Silly little creature.
Why do you sit there staring at those papers? They do not look good to eat.
No, one does not eat letters. They bear news of distant friends and acquaintances.
What sort of news? What a strange way to carry news. That is what fairy dragons do, you know.
You are the post of the dragon world? Anne chuckled. This was not the first time they had this conversation, but the shatter-brained little flitterbit never seemed to remember it.
If that means we spread important news, yes, that is what we do. Why else would even the grumpiest of major dragons tolerate us in their territory? We have our value as more than a snack, you may be certain.
Peony looked so proud. She puffed her chest and raised her beaky snout. It would not do to tell her just how reliable fairy dragon-carried news was generally considered.
What news have you? I can share it if you like.
I will need to read it first before I can know. Can you wait that long? Anne scratched under Peony's chin.
Be quick about it.
She stretched and turned her head to direct Anne's ministrations behind her left ear. Continuing her scratching, Anne scanned Mrs. Smith's letter. Well, that was interesting. Who would have expected news of interest to father in this letter?
Do tell, do tell.
Peony hopped and cheeped. This one is from a friend. It contains some sad news.
Sad?
Peony fluttered in a downward spiral until she landed on sandy ground in front of the bench and looked up at Anne.
What is sad to a warm blood?
The addle-pated little creature probably just wanted to mock her. Fairy dragons could be like that, but it was difficult to resist answering a direct question. Death and loss are sad. My friend tells me she still feels the consequence of her husband's, mate's, death at harvest time last year. According to her, our cousin, who did business with her husband, lost his mate at the end of winter, and it seems his business is not doing well either. Those are sad things.
Why do you bother with letters when they only bring you sad things?
Peony cocked her head this way and that, as though thinking made her head hurt. It is not all sadness. She finds herself in Bath, in comfortable establishment, with good company. Those are all good things, as is this. Anne held up a thick, as yet unopened missive, her heart beating a little faster. This is a letter, a very long one, from the dragon sage herself, telling me more about you and your kind. I count that as very good news indeed. Peony flipped her wings.
Why do you need a letter when you can ask us directly, warm bloods?
Snorting, she launched herself into the sky and flitted away. Shatterbrained, definitely shatterbrained. Anne stood and hugged the letter to her chest. The dragon sage, Lady Elizabeth Darcy, had actually written back to her. No, it should not have been surprising. As Anne understood, it was the dragon sage's role to answer such missives as hers. But having only been to the Blue Order once, to be presented and accepted by them shortly after she began to hear dragons, it seemed more likely that they would forget her than try to assist. At first, they had answered her letters promptly and with some attention to detail, but over time the letters grew shorter and less addressed toward her questions, taking longer and longer to arrive, until they finally stopped. Lady Russell thought it proof the Blue Order was just a matter of pomp and circumstance, not a serious force to be reckoned with. But a few comments in the last letters Father had received from them, pro forma reports that went out regularly to all dragon keepers, seemed to suggest there were some serious matters afoot, matters more urgent than the needs of a slumbering dragon. So perhaps the neglect was not a personal affront, but an oversight from an overworked, overwrought office. It was still possible that the letter contained a reproach for daring to address the dragon sage directly, and without invitation, but it was unlikely a missive of that length was required for a simple rebuke. Lady Russell would want to see the sage's letter for herself. She had insisted a reply would never come. Best get to Kellynch Cottage before some other urgent matter arose. Anne hurried down the shady, hardwood-lined footpath to the flower garden behind Kellynch Cottage. Lady Russell often enjoyed the afternoon sunshine in the midst of the fragrant, exotic blossoms she raised there. "Lady Russell! Lady Russell?" The regal, yes, that was the word for her when she stood in repose amidst her prize possessions. Cockatrix posed under a white wooden arbor lined with white and pink climbing roses in full bloom, standing on one leg, her thinking posture, with her head tucked up under her wing. She could, and should be mistaken for a large blue garden statue by those who did not hear dragons. If seen by those who could hear, oh, the secrets that had to be kept. Anne pressed a hand to her ribs, Best not think about that now. One crisis at a time.
Anne?
Lady Russell pulled her head from under her wing. Her plumed crest of variegated blue, yellow, and green feathers sprung up to its full glory. The feathers resembled peacock feathers without the distinct eyes. How many ladies would envy such a headdress to accompany their evening wear? More to point, how many ladies did, unaware that they were being convinced those feathers were part of a turban worn by a fine lady, not perched on the head of a dragon. Anne pressed her eyes with thumb and forefinger. Even after 5 years, this was all still very strange. "I have a letter from the dragon sage." Anne waved the still-sealed missive in Lady Russell's view. She snorted and shook her head feathers flopping to and fro.
"I am sure it is merely to rebuke you for your cheek. I do not see why you bother with that slip of a girl."
"As I understand, she is just a few years younger than myself. Hardly a slip of a girl." Or so father was wont to remind her. "Besides, you were the one who mentioned that it was approaching 50 years that Kellynch had been sleeping, and he should awaken very soon."
"I have known Kellynch longer than she has been alive. I do not see why you needed to consult her, or anyone else on the matter."
Lady Russell stepped high and long through the rose beds to stand on the path beside Anne, bringing the sweet scent of roses with her. "Have you ever dealt with a dragon awakening from hibernation?"
"No, but neither has she. I am certain of it. Besides, I am a dragon. That should count for a very great deal."
Lady Russell stomped her long-toed, clawed feet, kicking up dust. "I am sure it does. But have you not told me that you are as different to Kellynch as I am to a horse?" Anne folded her arms across her chest, tucking the letter under her left arm. Lady Russell snorted. "What is more, you have said that your kind do not hibernate. So how would you know anything about hibernation?"
"But I am a dragon."
Lady Russell bobbed her head back and forth, up and down, as though that proved her point. "One with no experience of hibernating, nor being awakened from such a state."
"What can an inexperienced girl contribute to this situation that I cannot? Truly, I should be offended by your lack of faith in me. Have I not been your teacher, your mentor in all dragon matters, since the day you first heard dragons?"
Lady Russell ruffled her full, fluffy wings, throwing up enough breeze to set the flowers around her to rustling. "Indeed you have, and for that I am very grateful. I know you have taught me from your wealth of knowledge everything you thought I ought to know." Anne smiled sweetly and bit her tongue. Best not mention that much of Lady Russell's wisdom frequently contradicted the official lore of the Blue Order, and there was a very great deal that Lady Russell failed to mention at all.
"Since you seem so determined, do read to me what this sage has to say. But do not be surprised when I tell you how wrong she is."
Perhaps Anne should have read the letter in private first, and only shared carefully considered parts with Lady Russell. Oh well, too late for such ideas now. Lady Russell picked her way through the flower beds toward a low wooden garden bench on the border of the sunshine and shade, her high steps exaggerated by her extremely long legs. She perched on the left side of the bench, sitting like a hen on her nest. Anne held her breath and pressed her lips hard. Lady Russell did not like being laughed at, or told she resembled a character from a panto. Anne wove her way down the path, sat beside Lady Russell, and cracked the seal on the letter. "Dear Miss Elliot, let me begin by telling you how glad I was to receive your letter. It truly is my pleasure to assist wherever I can in smoothing relations between dragon mates. I have tried to answer as many of your questions as possible, but I am certain the answers will leave you with even more questions. Pray do not hesitate to ask them in your next letter, which I expect, dare I say insist, you will write to me very soon. I look forward to enjoying an active conversation with you. I hope you do not think me too forward to say I am fascinated by the circumstances of Kellynch, and consider it my privilege to be invited to assist in these matters." Gracious! That sounded nothing like the correspondence Anne had previously received from the Order. The sage almost sounded like a friend.
So, what does it say?
Lady Russell snorted, ruffling the paper just a bit. Lady Elizabeth begins with the usual greetings and salutations. Nothing you would wish to hear. Lady Russell rolled her dark, glittering eyes and fluffed her wings. Such a temper she was in. Anne pointed to several lines near the top of the page. Here, she addresses the matter directly. She says no keeper alive in England today has ever assisted with a dragon awakening.
You see, I told you, she knows nothing.
Lady Russell pecked at the paper. Anne jerked it away just in time to keep it from being torn by Lady Russell's sharp beak. She says she would come herself to assist us, and she does not say it directly, but I infer that she is in a delicate condition and not able to make such a journey.
That is a very good thing indeed. I have no desire to have such a person poking her nose into our affairs, where it does not belong.
I understand the need for secrecy and discretion here, but truly, she is the dragon sage. How could her visit be of any difficulty to us? Lady Russell hissed. She actually hissed, and whipped her head around to glower directly into Anne's eyes.
What does it matter? You said yourself she is not able to travel, so it is a moot point. Has she anything useful to say?
Anne edged back, eyes watering from Lady Russell's potent breath. Perhaps she should recommend some mint leaves to chew. This is encouraging. She says she has searched the annals of dragon lore and found several accounts of slumbering dragons awakening.
She has she? I am so pleased for her.
You need not sit here and listen. Anne stood and sighed. You asked me to read it to you, but if it upsets you, then I shall take my letter and return home, and read it far more conveniently. Lady Russell blocked Anne's way.
No. I would rather know what sort of advice you are getting and trying to follow. Better that I stop you from doing something foolish before you begin.
Anne clutched her forehead and turned her back. Such faith you have in me.
Anne, my dear, you know I have only the best in mind for you. You must know that. How can you expect me to trust a girl I have never even met to give you good advice?
Lady Russell leaned over Anne's shoulder. I suppose the faith the Blue Order places in her might be some indication.
Enough of your cheek. Just read the letter.
Anne returned to the bench and spread the letter over her lap. Very well. She says that while there are differences by species, there are some commonalities among them. She says they awaken slowly by stages, and may not be fully awake for several days or even a sennight or more. Lady Russell huffed and sneered, a difficult expression to achieve with a beak.
I am certain she is quite wrong about that. Perhaps Kellynch is of a species this sage knows little about.
She also says that dragons wake up cranky, very cranky, and one should be very careful not to provoke a cranky dragon, as they might be apt to act without thinking. Lady Russell muttered under her breath, but it sounded like,
Well, at least that is sensible.
And hungry. Dragons awaken very hungry. She likens it to hatching hunger, which, by the way, you have never mentioned to me.
New babies are hungry. What is there special in that?
Perhaps the amount such a baby might eat. In any case, the letter says that for a waking dragon like Kellynch, we must be prepared with a daily sheep, perhaps even 2 for at least a fortnight.
I am certain that is utterly excessive. Even so, what problem is that? There is plenty of mutton afoot.
Anne looked into the sky and huffed. I think the shepherds might find it a bit unusual to find so many sheep going missing at once. At the very least, it is something I can prepare for. Lady Russell pawed at the loamy ground.
Anyone with common sense might have come to the same conclusion. You did not need a sage to tell you that.
Had I known about hatching hunger, perhaps, Anne muttered under her breath. The sage went on to say the hunger would depend on how the dragon had prepared for it before hibernation, something Lady Russell had never mentioned. Probably not the best time to mention it. This is interesting. Anne held the letter a little closer to her face. She says that once the hunger for food is sated, if the dragon is a hoarding type, then the hoarding hunger must be dealt with. You have never spoken to me about hoarding.
What is there to say? Some dragons like to collect things. Those who do like it a very great deal.
Is Kellynch such a dragon?
How would I know?
Lady Russell flapped and stepped back. She says I should consult the Blue Order Charter to determine if he is a hoarder, and what the provisions of the hoard might be. But I have been searching for it since Mr. Elliot asked about it years ago. I have been able to turn up nothing of the charter, so we have little remedy there. You are his watcher. Why do you not know such a thing about Kellynch?
You are impertinent today.
Lady Russell snapped her beak hard. Anne jumped back. And you have not taught me all I need to know. Why is it so much of what you have taught me disagrees with the writings of the Blue Order?
Because I am a dragon, and I know better. What could they possibly know?
A very great deal of very important things, it would seem. Anne bit her tongue hard, reminding Lady Russell that a great number of the Blue Order members were dragons would only make her lose her temper. Lady Russell glowered at the letter, her expression shifting as she stared into Anne's eyes. This was not the first time she had tried to intimidate Anne into silence, but today it would not work. Finally she squawked and flapped, pecking at the letter. Anne yanked it away.
Impertinent, headstrong girl! How dare that ridiculous sage meddle in what she does not understand?
Lady Russell took several steps back, a shudder working down from her crest to her tail.
What does she know? Do not bother yourself with that woman. Concern yourself with dealing with the matters at hand. That is what is important right now.
As you say. Anne folded the letter and stood. Lady Russell reached for the letter with her beak, but Anne pulled it away. No, I will keep it. There are some details about the care Kellynch might require when he awakes that I will need to refer to. Not to mention, there were many pages she had not yet read. Lady Russell grumbled under her breath, a sound very like a growl, but she relented and stalked away. Very odd behaviour for her, but Lady Russell did tend to be temperamental. Chapter 2. Late June 1814. A fortnight later, Anne pushed back from the dragon sage's letter and the open books littering her oversized oak writing desk, and stood, her wrinkled muslin skirt swishing across her stiff knees. How had it got so late? The sunlight barely reached her room now, leaving the soft green walls dark, even though midday approached, drawing the sun to the other side of the house. No, it was not ladylike to stretch and groan, but what else might be expected after so many hours hunched over books and letters that her entire world smelt like books? Besides, if there was no one to watch, was it really unladylike? Surely all ladies stretched. Might it not be that the impropriety of it came with being observed in the act? She pressed her pounding temples hard. Why was she even considering such an irrelevant line of thought right now? There were far more significant considerations to dwell upon. Dealing with a dragon awakening was far more complex and delicate than Lady Russell had led her to believe. She straightened and re-straightened the floral curtains that had hung over her shoulder as she studied. The dragon sage had been very thorough in her research, noting every case of hibernations in the last 200 years. What an enviable library of records she must have access to. The trouble was that there were not many awakenings, and most of those did not proceed well. Not to mention they only had written records to go by. No living eyewitness, human or dragon, to the events remained. In 2 cases, keepers had been seriously injured by confused waking dragons. In one, the keeper had been killed and eaten, though to be fair, that was the oldest recorded case, and little was understood about managing a waking dragon, so perhaps that would not be the best event to cite as typical. She laced her fingers behind her neck and pulled her shoulders back. But then again, Anne knew little about dragons. Her father knew little about dragons. Though Lady Russell was a dragon, It did not follow that she would know very much about Kellynch's specific kind of dragon. Whatever kind that was. Another useful piece of information that was supposed to be listed in the missing charter, and unknown to Lady Russell. Even the sage had been unable to turn up Kellynch's charter in the Blue Order records. She had not given up, though, but there was no immediate remedy even there. In the meantime, the sage's most recent letter, which had arrived only yesterday, suggested that Anne consult the local minor dragons. It was just possible that there might be one in residence who had been witness to Kellynch's last brief awakening, for he had probably awakened 50 years ago, but it seemed that he was still dissatisfied with the Elliots then, and immediately returned to hibernation, who might be cajoled into helping her. The sage included a list of foodstuffs which might be useful in said cajoling. Of course, what a very good, even obvious idea. One she should have come up with herself, or Lady Russell, or even Father. Why did both of them seem so very determined not to know anything more than they already did? Why did they prefer ignorance in so many things? Father cared neither to know about the dragon he was supposed to keep, nor about the finances of the estate he held. Somehow he simply assumed he could go about and do as he liked, and things would all work out around him. Neither tenants, nor tradesmen, nor servants would ever be a bother to him. All he had to do was act the part of a baronet, be seen doing so, and all would be well in the world. She flexed her hands in and out of fists. At least she could identify dragon heroes now, even when they were not wearing the Order's signet. Apparently the knack was a bit unusual, and many found it uncanny. But Lady Russell said Mamma could do the same thing. That had been an important part of their friendship. She hoped that Anne might continue to render that invaluable service to her friend, helping her to stay hidden from prying eyes. Avoiding hiring dragon-hearing staff was imperative. Anne threw her hands into the air and wandered to her oak-framed cheval mirror. Her dress was rumpled, and hair tousled from running her fingers through it. Her appearance was as bedraggled as she felt. If she did not tidy up before leaving her room, an unpleasant lecture from Father or Elizabeth would be certain. She pulled the pins from her hair and reached for her hairbrush. Lady Russell's secret did explain some of her reticence. Perhaps Anne needed to find a way to help her present herself to the Blue Order, so she would not constantly be so nervous and guarded around company with whom she was unfamiliar. But until Anne herself was better informed, she would have little sway with Lady Russell. One more reason why it was so important to manage Kellynch's awakening properly. If that went well, that should give her better standing with Lady Russell and the Order, and if it did not, well, it was possible that she would not be around to worry about the aftermath. She shook away the tremor in her hands and braided her hair. She would prove herself a competent dragon-keeper, somehow. Best begin with the matter of feeding him. It only stood to reason that one would be hungry after sleeping for many years. If she was hungry in the morning after awakening, how much more would a dragon want to break his fast? But how to manage so many sheep from the flocks? Wait, Shelby, the lead sheepdog, was a dragon. Why had she not thought sooner to enlist his help? It should have been so obvious. Lady Elizabeth's last letter had all but said that. Why had she not said it directly? Perhaps because she was polite and thoughtful, and wanted to permit Anne the dignity of puzzling something out on her own. When she behaved like that, after only a very few letters, it was difficult not to think of Lady Elizabeth as a friend. Perhaps it was too forward, but for now it was comforting. Anne smoothed her dress and slipped on her bonnet. A visit to Shelby was definitely in order. The afternoon sun proved a bit warmer than she would have preferred, but that was usually favorable for sighting the small dragons that populated the estate. Beyond the harem of fairy dragons and Jet, the big black cockatrice who made the occasional cranky, snappy appearance, there were not many of them. But the few that there were had become familiar and even amiable toward her, except for Jet, of course. He was uniformly cross and crass toward everyone, human and dragon, and still resentful of her restrictions, limiting him in what and whom he could eat. Like the rest of the estate, the other little dragons came to her when they had need of anything, sometimes even if it was simply a scratch behind the ears. The little puck Bee-Balm very much liked a good scratch behind her frill. Once one became accustomed to her fangs, Bee-Balm was quite an attractive creature, even cute. Anne chuckled under her breath. Father would never consider a dragon cute. The pasture's green carpet spread out before her, fragrant with fresh green smells and a soft breeze, dotted with sheep and lambs. She whistled sharply, another unladylike behaviour, or so Elizabeth had scolded, though dragons did not appear to concern themselves with such things. Whistling was, all told, the best way to get Shelby's attention, far more effective than shouting his name. A growly sort of bark in the distance assured her that Shelby had heard and would be on his way as soon as he was able. He was, after all, working, and she should not expect him to ignore his responsibilities. A few minutes later, the minor drake trotted toward her, his brown and white splotched hide dusty from the pasture, bits of grass sticking to his short pointed ears and long thick tail. His long claws threw up little clods of soil as he walked. He claimed they allowed him to run very fast and turn sharply when he was chasing down the sheep. They also made him a little dangerous-looking.
"Good day to you, miss."
Shelby's voice was thick and rough, rather like the local shepherd's. He stopped in front of her and bent his front knees in a dragonish bow. "Good day to you, Shelby." She crouched near him and extended her hand. He stretched his neck and presented his ears to her for a vigorous scratch. His tail thumped just like a dog's, but he rumbled deep in his throat in an almost cat-like purr. "Pray, may I ask your assistance? It is for Kellynch." He sat on his haunches, his brow furrowing.
"I suppose. You know he will be awakening soon."
"I have been concerned that might be the case. I have wondered if you were here the last time he awakened."
"I were just a drakeling then, but yes, I was here. Remember it quite clear, too. Not the sort of thing that happens to one every day, you know."
"It is a sight few have seen, and I am told no dragon keeper alive today has experienced such a thing. Pray, will you tell me what you know of his awakening? Anything you could tell me would be most appreciated." He bumped his head under her hand. His ears were in need of more scratching.
"The signs of a waking dragon are quite clear, if you know what to attend to. He will become restless, turning this way and that in his caverns. You feel the rumblings in your feet, if you pay attention."
The sage had not mentioned such a sign.
"You probably cannot feel it in that house of yours. His scent will also change. When he sleeps, he smells woolly, like the sheep, but when he awakes, his musk grows stronger and a bit sharp, like piss. As he gets closer to waking, he will snore loud, like distant thunder."
"Have you seen any of these signs? As I understand, it has been close to 50 years since he last awoke, and he should be close to rising."
"I had expected to see and hear more by now, but not so much. It is surprising. Perhaps he has decided to sleep longer, perhaps concerned that his territory is still run by Elliots. I think he has been put out with your family for quite some time."
Shelby shrugged and scratched behind his ear.
"Still, though, I would have expected at least a wee awakening, like when one rolls over at night and goes back to sleep. Except I would think he would take some time to eat a mite and survey his territory."
Anne bit her lip. "The sage said nothing about hibernating dragons having brief wakings."
"Perhaps it is because he is a worm, and worms do not normally hibernate. That is usually the province of drakes, ones bigger than myself, I mean."
Shelby chewed at his back claws, freeing some gravel from between his toes.
You are planning to be there when he awakes, are you not? I imagine he will want to meet you. No keeper attended his last awakening. Not your father, nor the older Mr. Sir Elliot. It was not a pretty thing.
What happened?
The usual thing one expects. Large dragons are very cranky beasts, and when they are hungry they are very cross. He was angry to find his keeper and heir absent, and to be attended only by myself. It fell on me and Uppercross.
Uppercross knows him.
Of course he does. They are neighbours. Why would he not?
Anne rubbed her hand over her lips. I thought large dragons were not amiable with one another. Is not that why the Blue Order assigns them particular territories?
I suppose that can be true. It might even be the usual way of things, but that does not mean that they all do not get along. Kellynch and Uppercross have been friends a long time.
I am all astonishment. Shelby's tail slapped the ground, probably annoyed with her ignorance.
You have not met Uppercross, have you?
No, not yet. I fear young Mr. Musgrove was a mite put out with me when he married my sister. Neither of them has offered an introduction, and I did not pursue one.
You should. You know the keepers aren't the only ones who can make you an introduction, don't you? Lady Russell can introduce you.
Well, that would have been helpful to know. It would also have been helpful for her to make the offer on her own.
Once you have met him, you will understand. It is hard to imagine that anyone, man or dragon, that would not get along with him. He is just like the Uppercross family, entirely friendly and agreeable.
I have never read an account of an agreeable major dragon. Quite the opposite, in fact.
He is a wyvern. Of all the big ones, they are the most apt to be agreeable.
I am glad to know that. So Uppercross was able to help you with Kellynch's awakening.
Indeed he did. He was able to talk sense into that cross creature, and keep him from wreaking havoc on the estate. Truly, miss, an angry dragon, large or small, is something to be avoided.
Shelby shuddered, scales rippling from his ears to his tail. Indeed, I will seek out Uppercross's advice. Would you be able to help me arrange provisions for Kellynch's waking hunger?
I have already been working toward that. There is a small flock set aside for that very purpose. Been persuading the shepherd for a year that he did not have as many sheep as he thought.
That would explain the discrepancy I found in the books.
That is part of the reason a keeper of some form or fashion, even a junior one like yourself, needs to be involved as well, to keep the dragon deaf unawares, you know.
Shelby cocked his head and wagged his tail, just on the edge of impertinence.
You will also want oil for his hide. All that time in the cavern will have left him dry and flaky, and very itchy. You might want to procure some good stiff brooms to help with the itch.
The sage had included a recipe for hide oil in her letter. She would have to prepare that herself. Since none of the staff heard dragons, and there were no household dragons to help with a persuasion, too many questions would arise from having a maid do the task.
Oh, and one more thing. His hoard. He will be very anxious for his hoard. You need to make certain all is in order with that.
Anne's stomach lurched, and her face grew cold. Hoard? Kellynch is a hoarder?
Oh, yes. He is most protective of his hoard, and insistent that his charter is fulfilled exactly.
How am I to do that? The charter has been missing for as long as I have known of its existence. I do not even know what he hoards. How could father mislay something so very important? Not to mention, think nothing of it. Shelby's forehead furrowed, and his head drooped a bit.
That is a problem indeed. Kellynch never let on what his hoard might be, nor where it was. Hoarders can be so protective and secretive of all things concerning their hoards. Always demanded that the yearly rations be delivered under cover of dark, and the like. The keeper is supposed to know all that, and ensure all is kept safe while the dragon is indisposed. Perhaps Lady Russell might be able to help?
I have asked, and she is not aware of anything related to his hoard either. Anne bit her knuckle. Certainly, father had not been spending money on anything as unconnected to him as a dragon hoard.
That is a problem, then. I am surprised his watcher would know nothing of it.
He wrinkled up his snout and squeezed his eyes half shut, as though thinking hard.
Perhaps Uppercross will know something. I do not think he hoards, but perhaps they might have talked about it.
He pushed his head toward her and leaned against her. Was he trying to comfort her? How dear. That is a very good suggestion. I will seek him out as soon as I can. Sheep bleated in the distance. Shelby made a noise like a
"Off? Must be off. Excuse me."
He trotted off, his tongue hanging out. Was that a normal dragon behavior, or did he do that to help him to affect his illusion as a dog? Hopefully getting an audience with Uppercross would not be too difficult. At least there was someone who could, hopefully, make her a proper introduction. Why had Lady Russell not already done so? Anne rubbed her cheeks hard. Probably because then she would have someone else to turn to for dragon advice, someone connected directly to the Blue Order, someone who might disagree with Lady Russell's advice, something Lady Russell did not tolerate well. Perhaps if Lady Russell would not make the introduction, Anne could find her way to Uppercross House and simply introduce herself. If Uppercross was as agreeable as Shelby said, perhaps he would not be affronted. An hour later, Anne joined Elizabeth in the parlour. Late-day sunlight poured through the windows, leaving the pale yellow room warm and welcoming, even though Elizabeth only acknowledged her with a raised eyebrow and returned to her ladies' magazine. Anne nodded to her and sat at the dainty oak and iron scrollwork writing desk behind Lady Russell's favourite overstuffed, rust-coloured chair near the window, overlooking Mother's blooming gardens. "Who are you writing to, Anne?" Elizabeth asked without looking up from her magazine. "Mary." Not that it really was any of Elizabeth's business, but it was easier to answer her than it was to argue the matter. "Better you than me. She never has anything interesting to say. She keeps no company of any worth, nor does the great house at Uppercross." Anne shrugged. Elizabeth could not be convinced that individuals of small fortune, with no titles or names of note, might be worth the acquaintance. She scented a piece of foolscap on the desk and dipped her pen in the ink. What had Mary said in her last letter, written in handwriting so small, tight, and whiny? Ah, yes, that she was so very unwell, and none understood nor cared that it was the case. No one attended her. She had run out of her favourite tea, and visits from the great house were very few, and when they happened, they were very, very short. "I do not see why you are writing to her. Mary is always sick, complaining, and cross." Elizabeth looked up briefly and rolled her eyes. "Do be kind. You know how the children tire her. That is what governesses are for. She should just send them off to school and be done with it. They are too young. I am sure they will go off with Charles' younger brothers soon. Not soon enough, if you ask me. I always make her feel better when I visit. Perhaps I should." Neither father nor Elizabeth need know who else she intended to visit whilst there. "Do what you will. I am sure father will not object. He hardly notices whether you are about or not." "I am glad you agree." Anne returned to her writing, and hid her sigh in a polite cough. Chapter 3. Late June 1814. Twilight. The last vestiges of sunlight hung low over the ends of the earth as mild salty air kissed his cheeks. Educated people laughed at the thought the world was flat, but here, in the middle of the open sea, bobbing with the restless waves, and no shore in sight, it felt otherwise. There on the western horizon, the sun dipped down to hide its light, maybe to rise again the next day, but then again, maybe not. Just because it did so every day before was no guarantee it would do so ever again. The future was as unfathomable as what might lie beyond the line that divided heaven from earth. A large, black, furry head rubbed against Wentworth's leg. How did Laconia always know when his thoughts had turned maudlin? The tatzelworm spring-hopped to the railing, lashing his tail tight around it. Only one other on the ship knew the secret of Laconia's legendary balance, as he tiptoed on the ship's rails and rigging, sure-footed as a mountain goat. The rest simply considered him quite the luckiest ship's cat in the history of the Navy. Since the ship's namesake arrived, their prizes had grown larger and more frequent, and their casualty rate diminished. Laconia was to thank on both counts. Small sea dragons proved only too willing to reveal the location of valuable prizes to Laconia, for the promise that Laconia's sailors would leave them and their hunting grounds in peace. Only a very little bit of persuasion was necessary to convince superstitious sailors to mind their ship's cat's signals. All told, it was almost too easy. He scratched behind Laconia's tufted ears. What a marvelous sound, that rumbling purr. It did something to one's soul, almost as healing as that steel-rasped tongue of his. According to the ship's physician, tatzelworm tongues had special healing properties. Wounds they licked were apt to heal quickly and cleanly. Wentworth's shoulders twitched as he kneaded the scar on his forearm. That cut could easily have gone septic. The tatzelworm's ministrations had been a test of Wentworth's mettle. Entirely worth enduring, to be sure, but a test nonetheless. He chuckled under his breath and moved to Laconia's favorite spot under his chin. Laconia rose up on tiptoes and arched his neck for more. That episode earned Laconia a near reverence among the sailors. No persuasion necessary. They almost fell over themselves to curry favor with him. Moreover, the crew was profoundly defensive of their lucky charm, and rejected any man who did not revere him appropriately. Though it proved a mite difficult on his ego that the ship's cat was possibly more popular than himself, the crew's unity that came with it was valuable. One more benefit the little dragon had brought into his life. "You are troubled," Laconia rumbled, looking up at him, great gold eyes gleaming in the moonlight. He pressed his head hard into Wentworth's hand and leaned his furry shoulder and all 3 stones of his weight into Wentworth's chest. Laconia's powerful purr reverberated through Wentworth's ribs. 5 years we have been together on the Laconia, my friend. I am able to watch the stars as well as you. I know how long it has been. Of course you do. You know we are sailing for England now. Laconia chirruped. And my directional sense is flawless. Why all the useless words? I suppose I am philosophic right now, and you know philosophy uses a great many useless words. Laconia snorted. The tip of his tail flicked against the wooden railing. It would not hurt the young dragon to learn a little patience. You know I will likely be beached when we anchor in Plymouth. With Napoleon safely in exile, there is far less need for ships on the sea. That is what troubles you. Laconia pushed the side of his face against Wentworth's chin. Long, prickly whiskers tickled Wentworth's nose as the edge of one fang scratched his cheek. Of course that troubles a sailor. Poor Benwick. He only just made captain on the Grappler, and now this. To take half pay as a captain instead of a lieutenant, without having hardly done the work for it, does not sound like such a bad thing. Laconia licked between the toes of his oversized thumbed paw. Could he make his disdain for Benwick any clearer? But what does one do on the land? I have been at sea for so long. Where do I even begin? With the Blue Order. Oversimplifying things as usual. What would they want with me? Modesty is not always a desirable quality in a warm blood. More than once I have heard you say it would be helpful in a dragon.
Dragon pride is more difficult than warm-blood pride. You are not apt to eat offending creatures.
Laconia licked at a loose scale on his thick black tail. It pulled off and fluttered to the deck, twinkling in the rising moonlight as it fell.
You are well known among the sea dragons. They ask for you by name now. Most of those around the English coast and in the Mediterranean know the Laconia by sight and see your arrival as a boon.
I will miss the many dragon friends we have made, but what has that to do with anything if I am to be beached?
As I understand, and I understand a great many things more than you realize.
Laconia pulled back slightly to look Wentworth square in the eye.
The Order has no liaison to maritime dragons. Perhaps it is time for one.
They have done without for what? 500 years, more or less? Why would they need one now?
Times change. Men change. The war with France has changed things, no? The Blue Order must change with the times, or the Pendragon Accords will become meaningless, and all that has been accomplished will be for naught. Even if they do not want a maritime officer, the Dragon Sage can always use those who can assist in dealing effectively with dragons. None can match your ease with seafaring dragons.
The Dragon Sage was a woman. Wentworth rubbed the back of his neck. That would be interesting. Taking orders from a woman. The whole notion did not seem to bother dragons, but it would take some getting accustomed to for a military man. Even if I should work for the Order, what else shall I do? Not even the highest officers of the Order spend all their hours working.
You need a mate.
The word hit like the pelting, stinging rains of a winter gale.
Your sister and her mate?
My sister is a rare and unique woman. Croft is very lucky to have her.
I have seen. You would benefit to be in the same way as he.
I dislike the notion of marriage. Laconia leaned in a little closer, nose nearly touching Wentworth's.
You are still resentful.
Wentworth grumbled under his breath and stepped back slightly. I have a very great deal to resent. She rejected me.
Can she hear dragons?
Laconia stretched out, impossibly long, to press his paws to Wentworth's shoulders. I never asked.
You cannot tell?
No, it is not apparent to most warm-bloods. She never mentioned it.
Did you?
No. Without a landed dragon, why would it matter? I did not have you then. I had little to do with the Order. Hearing dragons was hardly something I considered significant in a wife.
Perhaps you should have. You certainly must now.
Laconia's fishy breath curled his nostrils. You live here amongst an entire crew who cannot hear dragons, save Riley, of course, and you manage quite well indeed. Does it really matter?
Here, I am a lucky omen, a ship's cat. I will lose that on land. I am told some there dislike cats, and even more black ones. I must have allies I can trust.
Laconia shrank back a little. For all his boldness in his home territory, he still, and probably always would, carried with him a not quite timidity, but a caution perhaps, born of his perilous hatching. Do you wish to stay with the ship? The words barely escaped in a hoarse whisper.
Do you want me to?
Laconia's head and shoulders drooped. Do you wish to stay? I have no desire to compel you against your will.
You are my friend, my particular friend. I do not wish to separate.
Laconia's paws inched higher on Wentworth's shoulders, and he leaned his weight into them. I am glad to hear that. Wentworth wrapped his left arm across Laconia's shoulders and scratched behind his right ear.
So your mate must be able to talk to me, and she must like me.
Why would someone not like you?
It happens. I will not live on land with someone who does not like me.
I would not ask you to do so.
Perhaps she could hear dragons.
Who? Anne? God above, it should not be so hard to say her name now.
Perhaps that was why she rejected you. She could hear, and you did not tell her you could as well. Their estate has a dragon. It only makes sense that she can hear.
Perhaps, but I still do not think so.
You should find out.
Why? It is nearly 8 years since I have seen her. I expect she is married off and has a house full of children by now.
And if not?
She rejected me. I have no desire to see her.
If you still resent her, you have feelings for her. You should see her.
Laconia jumped off the railing and spring-hopped off, disappearing into the deep night shadows. Stubborn, stubborn creature. But perhaps he did have a point. Marriage and a proper home, with the proper woman, not Anne Elliot, might not be so bad a thing. Chapter 4. Late June, 1814. Well, that was very interesting. Anne pushed herself up from her perch on a cool and dusty garden rock amongst the fragrant bee-balm and brushed the dirt from her skirt. There was a very great deal of dirt. The heat of the day had just finished banishing the morning's cool freshness, and beads of sweat trickled down the back of her neck. Bother. The dress would have to be washed to get rid of it all. That did not happen nearly so much before she had started speaking to dragons. In the 3 days since she had been trying to learn more about Kellynch's hoard from the local estate dragons, it seemed every one of her gowns suffered. The whole dragon-hearing, dragon-keeping business was very hard on one's wardrobe. At least the talk with Bee-Balm had proved productive, if also rather disappointing at the same time. Matters would be so much easier if the little Puck only knew where Kellynch kept his hoard. But then again, it would not be very safe if every minor dragon in the territory knew where it was, would it? The logic was difficult to fault. Anne brushed loose dirt from her hands. Still, though, as the sage's most recent letter predicted, she had learnt much from the encounter. Lady Elizabeth had suggested Anne discover what the Puck hoarded, and offer something to add to the hoard. Admittedly, it had sounded a bit pointless, but the sage was a sage for a reason, and truly, what harm could there be in bringing Bee-Balm a bit of honey? Especially during one of those times when Jet had disappeared from the estate, and she was feeling safer to be out of her lair. The transformation in the little green-brown dragon was almost instantaneous. Her eyes went wide, and her colour seemed to change from dull to glowing. Who would have expected the creature to all but lose the power of speech as she slavered over the sealed honey-pot, licking traces of honey from the seal? How funny she looked, on her back, feet in the air, turning the jar round and round in the sunbeam, admiring it from every angle, just before she disappeared with it underground. A quarter of an hour later, Bee-Balm returned, still looking dazed, like one who had too much wine the night before, gracious and grateful for the gift she had been bestowed, and ready to offer whatever information she had, which was, unfortunately, very little indeed. It was like the monograph on hoarding said, a hoarding dragon was a bit like an opium eater. When they got what they craved, they were in ecstasy, a little frightening to watch, truth be told. No need to test the warnings of what would happen if they did not receive their prize. Troublesome. Very troublesome. Anne wiped her hands on her apron and turned down the garden path, air heavy with the sweetness of blossoms and buzzing with the hum of bees at work. One of a keeper's duties toward a hoarding dragon, and not all of them were, though no one was exactly sure why, was to supply a yearly offering of a dragon's allotted hoard. Naturally, the household books made no mention of anything being set aside for Kellynch's hoard during his long slumber. No doubt he would require, and was legally entitled to, a full accounting and payment upon awakening. That was indeed a problem. What would happen if, when, they could not? Father's debts, it seemed, were substantial now. How could they possibly acquire enough to supply 50 years of any sort of hoarding supply to Kellynch, much less something of the sort to satisfy a major dragon? Kellynch was probably not the sort to be satisfied with buttons. She wrapped her arms around her chest and held her shoulders. The monograph suggested that Kellynch could turn angry, even violent over that. Moreover, he had recourse against them with the Blue Order. If he registered a complaint, then the Order might begin an investigation into the dragon-keeping that had, or in this case, had not been going on at Kellynch. Father he would be found negligent, and at that point all manner of punitive measures could be taken. They probably would not look favourably upon the junior keeper either. Father could even lose his estate. That would probably be the death of him, and maybe even Elizabeth too. There must be something she could do. There had to be.
Anne! Anne!
Lady Russell ran through the garden toward her, with wings held wide, in long, loping strides that closely resembled flight. Anne jumped aside just before Lady Russell collided with her. "Heavens! What is wrong?"
"I must speak to you right away."
"I can see that. Are you ill? Is someone hurt?"
No. I'm afraid it is much worse than that. Come, we must find a private place to talk."
Lady Russell pointed with her beak toward the glassed-in conservatory attached to Kellynch Cottage. Cottages normally did not have conservatories attached, but Sir Henry had installed that for her decades ago to assist in her cultivation of exotic species. Back then he appeared the doting husband. Anne's face grew cold as she trotted in a most unladylike fashion behind Lady Russell. The news must be dreadful indeed to induce the cockatrix to run so openly. Lady Russell shut the door to the small, well-filled conservatory, and made sure the door from the house was shut and locked as well.
"Cover your ears."
Why should Lady Russell issue such an order? Flanked by bushy citrus trees, Anne obeyed. Lady Russell flapped her wings and jumped to the top of a statue in the centre of the conservatory, the highest point in the room. She threw back her head and trumpeted such a sound. Anne's ribs vibrated with the noise. 2 red fairy dragons, familiar members of the local harem, fell out of the potted orange trees, and 3 dirty garden worms, 2 adults and a juvenile, popped out of the ground, writhing in pain.
"Out! Out! All of you get out!"
Lady Russell swept them toward the outside door with her wings, her talons scraping along the stone floor. Anne opened the door, standing carefully out of the way, and closed it again behind the intruders. The warm, still air suddenly weighed as much as a winter cloak.
"Lock the door. There always seems to be some small dragon about to overhear what one does not want heard."
Lady Russell stalked back to a stone bench near the central statue, and paced long, thoughtful strides around the marble cherub, low-hanging branches and vines catching at the spectacular plumage of her tail.
"It is not at all what I expected. Not at all. And it is very bad."
"Pray stop telling me how bad it is, and tell me what it is." Anne sat on the cool seat.
"I have found Kellynch's charter."
"Found the charter? Where?" "I have searched everywhere."
"That is part of what is so troubling."
Lady Russell stalked to a table she used for potting plants, and pried open a drawer to remove a crumpled and dirty set of papers. "Why do they look so ill-used?" Anne took them and smoothed them over her lap, the blue ink seal of the order prominent at the top of the page. Probably how Lady Russell inferred this was the charter. How well she was actually able to read was still a bit of a mystery. At least she was right. It would be awful to have to tell her she was in error. "Where did you find this?"
"On the grounds, in the woods, near Kellynch's lair. Many boot prints nearby. I think someone must have dropped it.
She tucked one leg up and hunched into her thinking posture.
But who would have had it when neither you nor your father knew where it was?
Shelby told me something of chasing an intruder off recently, but as I understand, that regularly happens during a full moon. The cook often sells scraps and used tea leaves from the back door of the kitchen, and not always to the most savoury of company. Anne peered at the stains on the papers and sniffed. Gravy. It smells as though it might have been used to wrap leavings from a meal. Perhaps. Father has never been careful with the document. I can only think he must have allowed it to become mixed in with other papers that found their way to the kitchen.
I do not like it. Strange people coming and going, important papers treated like rubbish.
She fluttered her wings and settled them across her back.
Perhaps you should read this all-important charter for yourself. The print is too small for my eyes, you see, but I am quite interested to hear what it says.
Anne's heart pounded hard enough to make reading aloud difficult. She traced the carefully written lines with her fingertip. Dates, name, dragon, family, officers of the order witnessing, defining the territory and duties to it. Here it is, hoarding.
Well, girl, what does it say?
Lady Russell stopped. It says Kellynch is a worm. It looks as though it might have specified the kind, but those words are too stained to read. Botheration. Apparently he is permitted to hoard wine. What would a worm want with wine?
Wine? I have never heard such a thing.
Lady Russell paced around the fat cherub statue, making little squawking sounds deep in her throat. Did she realize angry hens did that same thing? Where would he keep such a hoard? Our wine cellar is hardly full. Where else could he keep it? And how are we to pay the portion on 50 years of hoarding? Father's debt to the wine merchant, actually to all 3 of the local merchants, is extreme. They are refusing to sell to him at all. Mr. Shepherd has been charged with finding another source of Father's favourite wines now that the household stock is dwindling.
Debts?
Lady Russell bounded to Anne's side in a frightening leap.
I know nothing of this.
Anne set the charter aside. She would have to finish reading that later. I am surprised you have not heard of the merchants complaining that he has not paid his bills. The situation is becoming quite serious. It seems the sort of thing the fairy dragons would have overheard.
No one pays those flutter-tufts any mind. Shatter-brained little creatures. What could they know?
Lady Russell clapped her beak rapidly, an expression of serious displeasure.
How could he? How could he? Debts are very dangerous for a dragon estate. He ought to know that. Surely you can see that.
You know Father has never cared much for being a dragon estate. Anne rubbed her temples. And yes, it was alarmingly obvious why debt and dragons were a very dangerous combination.
Well, that is true. One would think he might be mindful of the very grave danger a hungry and angry dragon might pose to him and his family.
I think, and I'm only supposing now, that he believes the Pendragon Accords will keep him safe from such an outcome. I gather that is a bad assumption.
When he has violated those accords himself, he has little to fall back upon.
Lady Russell threw her head back, chittering a little like a fairy dragon.
Things are far worse than even you imagine. It never dawned on me that the Elliots might stoop so low.
What else has my family done? Anne squeezed her eyes shut and shook her head.
Well, to be entirely fair, I cannot be certain that it is your family.
What has happened?
Come, I suppose you should see it for yourself.
Lady Russell's head hung down almost to the ground as she headed for the cottage door. Where are you taking me?
Into the dragon tunnels beneath the estate.
Lady Russell strode into the cool and mildly damp kitchen, with no cook or maid in sight, straight to the basement door. She pointed to a torch just beside the door.
Light that. You will need it.
Tunnels? What tunnels? There were dragon tunnels under Kellynch? Anne lit the torch from the kitchen fire and followed Lady Russell down the narrow, uneven basement steps. She had never been in a basement before. What an odd thing to realize. She had lived above a basement all her life, and had never ventured inside it. Father said it was the realm of servants and those beneath her, literally and figuratively. Did these tunnels that Lady Russell spoke of extend to the manor as well? Much cooler, dark and dank, it smelt of stone and dirt, and a vague musk that was usually associated with dragons. Do garden worms come here?
Occasionally. I persuade the cook to store bowls of scraps down here for them.
That is kind of you.
It is useful to have friends among the minor dragons. One never knows when such help might be needed.
Lady Russell picked her way down the stairs. A chill breeze made the torch waver and sputter as they entered a low tunnel in the far corner of the long basement. Any lower, and she would have had to crouch to get through it. Who would put a tunnel here? Claw marks suggested it had been dragon-dug. Of course it had been. How else would Kellynch traverse the estate without being seen? Such things were written of in dragon estates, the design and establishment thereof to the benefit of both species. It made sense that Kellynch lands would conform to those descriptions even though no current resident treated it as though it were a dragon estate. The narrow, winding tunnel, floor and walls rough and uneven, led down and to the right, then left, then right again. The sputtering torchlight barely allowed her to see 3 steps ahead of her. Lady Russell ignored 3 side tunnels along the way, and finally ducked into a short, wide passage on the left. Anne ducked to follow. Hopefully it would not be very much farther. She could not continue in this half-crouch for very long. There! Lady Russell pointed with her wing. Anne took several more steps, holding the torch in front of her. An oblong room, maybe 10 feet wide and twice as long and half again as tall as she, opened before her. Thank heavens, she could stand straight again. Several open crates, a small barrel bound with iron hoops, and a broken bottle littered the floor of the blind chamber. Faint scents filled the air. Stone, old straw, wood, iron, and weak notes of wine. How did you find this place? Lady Russell clawed at the stone floor.
The last page of that charter document has a diagram on the back. It looked like a map to the dragon tunnels. I thought it worth exploring before dragging you about in all the dark and dirt.
Anne touched the nearby barrel that lay on its side. Empty. It rolled away at her touch. The crates, lids pried off, and half full of straw, held nothing of value. Heavens above! This was the hoard?
I cannot imagine it would be anything else. Why would anyone but a dragon, especially one who hoards wine, store wine in such an inaccessible place? From the looks of it, the room used to be full.
Anne gasped and fell back against the rough wall.
Stealing a dragon's hoard is a high crime, and it carries a heavy penalty.
Anne leaned her head back and breathed heavily, but it did not relieve the weight on her chest. I cannot imagine it was Father who planted it. I know we have not drunk any of the vintages on these labels.
It does not really matter. He is keeper and responsible for what happens in the keep. When Kellynch discovers this, he could easily go into a frenzy of hoarding hunger. It would not be unheard of for him to kill his keeper, and possibly his watcher, over such a transgression.
She bounced from one foot to the other rapidly. But the Accords forbid that, or I thought they did.
Not when a crime of this magnitude has been committed.
There is no money to replace any of this, Anne whispered through her hand.
No money? There is truly no money? Your father's debts are that extreme?
Lady Russell peered close into Anne's face, looking rather fearsome in the flickering torchlight. Quite extreme, I fear. I overheard a conversation with Mr. Shepherd, something about the local merchants talking about banding together for a writ of debt. Lady Russell hunched into her thinking posture again, and remained silent for several long minutes.
That is bad, and yet, perhaps, Yes, I think it might just be the thing. I think I know how we can use it to buy a bit of time for us to solve the problem.
I do not understand.
Retrenching. You and I will devise a plan of retrenching that will remove the family from Kellynch for an extended period. That will allow me some time to work on Kellynch and perhaps avert a tragedy. I will present it to your father and persuade him.
As I understand, according to the Blue Order, you are not allowed to persuade a dragon hearer. Anne chewed her fingernail.
This is an extreme situation, and your father has little desire not to be persuaded. Trust me, it is for the best.
But if we retrench, will that not place tenants at risk from Kellynch?
I do not think so. Kellynch will know he cannot hold them responsible for what has happened. I will enlist Uppercross to help with him as well.
It would have been nice if you had introduced me to him, Anne muttered under her breath, clutching her waist and rocking back and forth against the cold, stony wall. It seems the only option, then. I suppose we must begin immediately. Yes, it was a sensible idea, completely sensible, and there was hardly any other choice. But was it not a very difficult thing to be forced from her home because of father's spendthrift ways and a dragon's madness? July 1st, 1814. 4 days later, Anne fought the urge to pace about the parlour like an anxious hen, instead forcing her limbs into quietude upon a dark gold wing-chair, Mother's favourite chair in this room, pulled near to Lady Russell and the windows. The sunshine-yellow walls tried to remind her to be cheerful, but their admonitions were lost in Lady Russell's murmurings.
If we can persuade your father to accept all this,
said Lady Russell, waving her wing over the papers spread on the low table between them,
much may be done. If he will adopt these regulations, in just 7 years he will be clear.
She settled her wings across her back and leaned against the back of her favourite overstuffed chair. Her bright blue feathers contrasted prettily with the deep rust upholstery. But is not our very purpose to have him leave Kellynch entirely, and refuse this plan of retrenching? Anne clutched her forehead and stared at the white peonies waving in the garden just beyond the windows. Peony, wren-catcher, and 2 of the blue fairy dragons cavorted above the blossoms. How lovely it would be to have wings and join them after these 4 days wasted, crafting pointless plans of economy to present to father. Lady Russell huffed and allowed her head to droop. Her very long neck made it a very dramatic expression, but perhaps she could not actually manage anything less sweeping.
I know, my dear, I know. But persuasion is much easier to achieve when the one being persuaded has some inclination to do as you suggest. He will despise these plans so much, suggesting he quit the house entirely and let it to tenants will be simple.
Anne clutched her forehead. What a sad statement that it was reasonable to expect father to despise sensible economies. What will you do when tenants have been found for the estate?
Much will depend upon the tenants. If they hear dragons, I will not be able to stay.
Perhaps not at Kellynch Cottage, but surely you can stay. You must. Kellynch will require his watcher.
I am well aware of that, but I have become accustomed to living like a civilized creature, not in some dark, dank cavern.
Lady Russell snorted and pawed the seat of the chair. Perhaps Shelby might be of some assistance. He might be able to provide you accommodations in one of the outbuildings? Lady Russell warbled.
Like a pigeon in a dovecote? I think not. I will find my own way, thank you. You just focus on managing your father.
Apparently, the Elliots were not the only ones at Kellynch with the problem of pride. But still, what was Lady Russell going to do? Ah, Lady Russell, how delightful to see you. Elizabeth swept into the parlour, her expression far less welcoming than her words. Anne stood. Lady Russell rose, shaking out her broad wings and tail into something that very much looked like a train. She strode over to Elizabeth's cheek, equally insincere, and peeked over Elizabeth's shoulder. Feathers ruffled down her back like a shudder. Mrs. Clay, Mr. Shepherd's daughter, who had recently come back to live with her parents in her widowhood, tittered a greeting from behind Elizabeth. The woman was simply insipid. It pained Anne to judge anyone so, but there it was, the awful truth. Her looks were average at best, and that was the best part of her personage. Her wit, her interests, even her manners ranked somewhere below her beauty. Father seemed to tolerate, even encourage, her attendance upon Elizabeth. Why he did so was utterly unfathomable, unless he simply enjoyed seeing someone fawning upon his daughter. That could be it.
"It is good to see you, Miss Anne."
Mr. Shepherd stepped into the room around Elizabeth and Lady Russell and bowed from his shoulders. He wore a fine new blue coat, and Mrs. Clay a new gown, a pale sprigged muslin affair that seemed intended to distract from the fact that she was both a widow and a mother of 2 young children. They had come into some sort of money recently, according to Mrs. Trent, who also did not approve of Mrs. Clay, but it was not her place to voice such opinions, except to Anne, of course. Everyone voiced their opinions to Anne, whether Shepherd's sudden increase was an honourable inheritance or, more likely, some sort of business venture which would make the improvement in their circumstances far less acceptable to Father, remained unclear. Mr. Shepherd looked a bit haggard, as though he dreaded presenting Father with some sort of news he would not want to hear, which was probably exactly the situation. Had a writ of debt actually been procured by the merchants? Father burst through the doorway, impeccably dressed and hair artfully arranged, and stopped 2 steps in, waiting, his features drawn into lines that usually presaged a fit of pique. Lady Russell curtsied, a curious feat when accomplished by a very tall bird. No, not bird, cockatrix.
"Ah, Sir Walter."
Anne, Elizabeth, and Mrs. Clay curtsied, and Mr. Shepherd bowed. That seemed to mollify Father's sensibilities just a mite. He nodded at Lady Russell and gestured for her to take a seat on the settee next to Elizabeth. If anyone else in the room could actually perceive Lady Russell folding herself to perch upon the hard, sleek cushions, they would laugh. There was a reason she did not like that particular seat.
"You look very serious today, Lady Russell,"
Father noted, his utter lack of interest in the matter clear in his tone. He took 2 more steps forward to centre himself in the room and brushed imagined dust from his sleeves.
"I am afraid I am. I am pressed by very weighty concerns."
She blinked slowly. Heavens, how long were her eyelashes?
"Is it a matter you would like to discuss?"
Father's posture made it clear he asked only because politeness required it.
I must, but I dread the possibility of upsetting you."
"Then perhaps," Elizabeth cleared her throat, "it ought not be brought up at all." Anne pressed her lips hard, and perched on the settee at Lady Russell's other side. How easily Elizabeth had adopted her father's favourite strategy for managing the unpleasant.
"I wish that were the case, but solicitous as I am for the Elliot name and reputation, I cannot indulge in such luxury. I am aware of a bit of unpleasant business for your family at the moment, and with Anne's assistance, I have drawn up some plans of retrenchment, in the hopes of being useful to you."
Lady Russell handed the papers to Father, pinched between the 2 odd little fingers at the tip of her wing. Mr. Shepherd's bushy eyebrows shot up like a startled fairy dragon, his eyes half surprised, half hopeful.
"Retrench? The very notion is absurd. An Elliot does not retrench."
Father took a step forward and planted his foot very hard. "Oh, Father, pray try to see reason. A person who has contracted debts must pay them. That is the law for peers, the gentry, and the common alike. Though a great deal is due to the feelings of a gentleman, like you, there is still more due to the character of an honest man." Anne whispered the last few words, heart pounding almost painfully. Too much rode on these next few moments. Father glowered at her and scanned the pages. He sniffed and snorted and sneered his way to the last page, striking it with the back of his hand.
"This is ridiculous.
We cannot possibly live the way that you suggest. A baronet must be seen to be living as a baronet." Lady Russell clucked her tongue.
Kellynch Hall has a respectability in itself, which cannot be affected by these reductions, and the true dignity of Sir Walter Elliot will be very far from lessened in the eyes of sensible people.